Chapter 7. That the truth of reason is not in opposition to the truth of the Christian faith. Now, though the aforesaid truth of the Christian faith surpasses the ability of human reason, nevertheless those things which are naturally instilled in human reason cannot be opposed to this truth. For it is clear that those things which are implanted in reason by nature are most true, so much so that it is impossible to think them to be false. Nor is it lawful to deem false that which is held by faith, since it is so evidently confirmed by God, seeing then that the false alone is opposed to the true, as is obvious if we examine their definitions. It is impossible for the aforesaid truth of faith to be contrary to those principles which reason knows naturally. Again, the same thing which the disciple's mind receives from its teacher is contained in the knowledge of the teacher, unless he teach fictitiously, which is wicked to say of God. Now the knowledge of naturally known principles is instilled into us by God, since God himself is the author of our nature. Therefore the divine wisdom also contains these principles. Consequently, whatever is contrary to these principles is contrary to divine wisdom. Therefore it cannot be from God. Therefore those things which are received by faith from divine revelation cannot be contrary to our natural knowledge. Moreover, contrary arguments bind our intellect so that it cannot advance to the knowledge of truth. Therefore, if conflicting knowledges were instilled into us by God, our intellect would thereby be hindered from knowing the truth, and this cannot be ascribed to God. Furthermore, things that are natural are unchangeable so long as nature remains, so contrary opinions cannot be together in the same subject. Therefore, God does not instill into man any opinion or belief contrary to natural knowledge. Hence the Apostle says, "The word is near you, on your lips and in your heart." This is the word of faith which we preach, Romans 10:8. Yet because it surpasses reason, some look upon it as though it were contrary to reason, which is impossible. This is confirmed also by the authority of Augustine, who says that which truth shall make known can in no way be in opposition to the holy books, whether of the Old or of the New Testament. From this, we may evidently conclude that whatever arguments are alleged against the teachings of faith, they do not rightly proceed from the first self-evident principles instilled by nature, hence they lack the force of demonstration and are either probable or are physical arguments, and consequently it is possible to solve them. Chapter 8. In what relation human reason stands to the truth of faith. It would also seem well to deserve that sensible things from which human reason derives the source of its knowledge retain a certain trace of likeness to God, but so imperfect that it proves altogether inadequate to manifest the substance itself of God. For effects resemble their causes according to their mode, since like action proceeds from like agent, and yet the effect does not always reach to a perfect likeness to the agent. Accordingly, human reason is adapted to the knowledge of the truth of faith, which can be known in the highest degree only by those who see the divine substance, insofar as it is able to put together certain probable arguments in support of it, which nevertheless are insufficient to enable us to understand the aforesaid truth as though it were demonstrated or understood in itself. And yet, however weak these arguments may be, it is useful for the human mind to be practiced in them, so long as it does not pride itself on having comprehended or demonstrated, since although our view of the sublimest things is limited and weak, it is most pleasant to be able to catch but a glimpse of them, as appears from what has been said. Chapter 5. The authority of Hilary concords with this, for he says in his book on the Trinity, Book 2, chapters 10 through 11, while speaking on the same truth, "Begin by believing these things, advance and persevere, and though I know you will not arrive, I shall rejoice at your advance, for he who devoutly follows in pursuit of the infinite, though he never come up with it, will always advance by setting forth. Yet do not pry into that secret, and do not meddle in the mystery of the birth of the infinite, nor presume to grasp that which is the summit of understanding, but understand that there are things you cannot grasp." Hilary, or chapter 9, of the order and mode of procedure in this work. Accordingly, from what we have been saying, it is evident that the intention of the wise man must be directed to the twofold truth of divine things and to the refutation of contrary errors, and that the reason's investigation can reach one of these, but the other surpasses every effort of reason. And I speak of a twofold truth of divine things, not on the part of God himself, who is truth, one and simple, but on the part of our knowledge, which has a variable relation to the knowledge of divine things. Therefore, in order to deduce the first kind of truth, we must proceed by demonstrative arguments by which we can convince our adversaries. But since there are no such arguments in support of the second kind of truth, our intention must be not to convince our opponent by our arguments, but to solve the arguments which he brings against the truth, because, as shown above, chapter 7, natural reason cannot be opposed to the truth of faith. In a special way, the opponent of this kind of truth may be convinced by the authority of Scripture, confirmed by God with miracles, since we do not believe what is above human reason unless God has revealed it. In support, however, of this kind of truth, certain probable arguments must be adduced for the practice and help of the faithful, but not for the conviction of our opponents, because the very insufficiency of these arguments would rather confirm them in their error if they thought that we assented to the truth of faith on account of such weak reasonings. With the intention, then, of proceeding in the manner laid down, we shall first endeavor to declare that truth which is the object of faith's confession and of reason's researches, by adducing arguments both demonstrative and probable, some of which we have gathered from the writings of the philosophers and of holy men, so as to thereby confirm the truth and convince our opponents. After this, so as to proceed from the more to the less manifest, we shall with God's help proceed to declare that truth which surpasses reason by refuting the arguments of our opponents, and by setting forth the truth of faith by means of probable arguments and authority. Book 4. Seeing then that we intend by the way of reason to pursue those things about God which human reason is able to investigate, the first object that offers itself to our consideration consists in those things which pertain to God in himself. The second, Book 2, will be the procession of creatures from him, and the third, Book 3, the relation of creatures to him as their end. Of those things which we need to consider about God and himself, we must give the first place, as to the necessary foundation of this whole work, to the question of demonstrating that there is a God. If this is not established, the entire consideration of divine things is taken away. God's existence, chapter 10. Of the opinion of those who say it cannot be demonstrated that there is a God, since this is self-evident. It may seem useless to some to endeavor to show that there is a God. They say that it is self-evident that God is, so that it is impossible to think the contrary, and thus it cannot be demonstrated that there is a God. The reasons for this view are as follow. Those things are said to be self-evident which are known as soon as the terms are known. Thus, as soon as it is known what is a whole and what is a part, it is known that the whole is greater than its part. Now such is the statement God is, for by this word God we understand a thing as greater than that which cannot be thought of. This is what a man conceives in his mind when he hears and understands this word God, so that God must already be at least in his mind. Nor can he be in the mind alone, for that which is both in the mind and in reality is greater than that which is in the mind only. And the very signification of the word shows that nothing is greater than God. Therefore it follows that God's existence is self-evident, since it is made clear from the very signification of the word. Again, it is possible to think that there is a thing which cannot be thought not to exist, and such a thing is evidently greater than that which can be thought not to exist. Therefore, if God can be thought not to exist, it follows that something can be thought greater than God, and this is contrary to the signification of the term. Therefore, it remains that God's existence is self-evident. Further, those propositions are most evident in which the self-same thing is predicated of itself, such as man is man, or in which the predicate is included in the definition of the subject. For instance, man is an animal. Now, as we shall show further on, chapter 22, in God alone do we find that his being is his essence, so that the answer is the same to the question, what is he, as to the question, is he? Accordingly, when we say God is, the predicate is either identified with the subject, or at least is included in its definition of the subject, and thus it will be self-evident that God is. Moreover, things that are known naturally are self-evident, for it is not by a process of research that they become evident. Now it is naturally known that God is, since man's desire tends naturally to God as his last end, as we shall show further on, Book 3, chapter 25. Therefore it is self-evident that God is, again, that by which all things are known must be self-evident. Now God is such, for just as the light of the sun is the principle of all visual perception, so the divine light is the principle of all intellectual knowledge, because it is in it that the first and greatest intellectual light is found. Therefore it must be self-evident that God is. On account of these and similar arguments, some are of the opinion that God's existence is so self-evident that the mind cannot think the contrary. Chapter 11. Refutation of the foregoing opinions and solution of the aforesaid arguments. The foregoing opinion arose from their being accustomed from the beginning to hear and call upon the name of God. Now custom, especially if it dates from our childhood, acquires the force of nature, from which it happens that the mind holds those things with which it was imbued from childhood as firmly as though they were self-evident. It is also a result of failing to distinguish between what is self-evident simply and that which is self-evident to us, for it is simply self-evident that God is, because God's essence is his existence. But since we are unable to conceive mentally what God is, it remains unknown in regard to us. Thus it is self-evident simply that every whole is greater than its part, but to one who fails to conceive mentally the meaning of a whole, it must be unknown. And so it happens that those things which are most evident of all are to the intellect what the sun is to the eye of an owl, as stated in Metaphysics, Book 2, Chapter 1, Paragraph 2. Nor does it follow, as the first argument alleged, that as soon as the meaning of the word God is understood, it is known that God is, first, because it is not known to all, even to those who grant that there is a God, that God is that thing, than which no greater can be thought of, since many of the ancients asserted that this world is God, nor can any such conclusion be gathered from the significations which Damascene assigns to this word God. Second, even granted that everyone understands this word God to signify something than which a greater cannot be thought of, it does not follow that something than which a greater cannot be thought of exists in reality. For we must allege a thing in the same way as we allege the signification of its name. Now from the fact that we conceive mentally that which the word God is intended to convey, it does not follow that God is otherwise than in the mind. Therefore neither will it follow that the thing than which a greater cannot be thought of is otherwise than in the mind. And thence it does not follow that there exists in reality something than which a greater cannot be thought of. Hence this is no argument against those who assert that there is no God, since there is nothing to prevent a person from thinking of something greater than whatever is granted to exist either in reality or in the mind, unless he grants that there is in reality something than which a greater cannot be thought of. Nor does it follow, as the second argument pretended, that if it is possible to think that God is not, it is possible to think of something greater than God, for the possibility of thinking that he does not exist is on account of the imperfection of his being, or the uncertainty of it, since in itself his being is supremely manifest, but is the result of the weakness of our mind, which is able to see him only in his effects and not in himself, so that it is led by reasoning to know that he is. From this the third argument is also solved, for just as it is self-evident to us that a whole is greater than its part, so is it most evident that those who see the very essence of God, that God exists, since his essence is his existence. But because we are unable to see his essence, we come to know his existence not in himself, but in his effects. The solution to the fourth argument is also clear, for man knows God naturally in the same way as he desires him naturally. Now man desires him naturally insofar as he naturally desires happiness, which is a likeness of the divine goodness. Hence it does not follow that God considered it himself is naturally known to man, but that his likeness is. Therefore man must come by reasoning to know God in the likeness to him, which he discovers in God's effects. It is also easy to reply to the fifth argument, for God is that in which all things are known, not so that other things are unknown unless he is known, as happens in self-evident principles, but because all knowledge is caused in us by his outpouring. Chapter 12. Of the opinion of those who say that the existence of God cannot be proved and that it is held by faith alone. The position that we have taken is also assailed by the opinion of certain others, by which the efforts of those who endeavor to prove that there is a God would again be rendered futile, for they say that it is impossible by means of the reason to discover that God exists, and that this knowledge is acquired solely by means of faith and revelation. In making this assertion, some were moved by the weakness of the arguments which certain people employ to prove the existence of God. Possibly, however, this error might falsely seek support from the statements of certain philosophers, who show that in God essence and existence are the same, namely, that which answers to the question, what is he, and that which answers to the question, is he? Now, it is impossible by the process of reason to acquire the knowledge of what God is, therefore it seems likewise impossible to prove by reason whether God is. Again, if as required by the system of the philosopher, in order to prove whether a thing is, we must take as principle the signification of its name, and since according to the philosopher the signification of a name is its definition, there will remain no means of proving the existence of God, seeing that we lack knowledge of the divine essence or quiddity. Again, if the principles of demonstration become known to us originally through the senses, as is proved in posterior analytics, those things which transcend all sense and sensible objects are seemingly indemonstrable. Now such is the existence of God, therefore it cannot be demonstrated. The falseness of this opinion is shown to us first by the art of demonstration, which teaches us to conclude causes from effects. Second, by the order itself of sciences, for if no substance above sensible substance can be an object of science, there will be no science above physics, as is stated in metaphysics. Third, by the efforts of the philosophers who have endeavored to prove the existence of God. Fourth, by the apostolic truth which asserts that the invisible things of God are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. Romans 1:20. Nor should we be moved by the consideration that in God essence and existence are the same, as the first argument contended, for this is to be understood of the existence by which God subsists in himself, of which we are ignorant as to what kind of a thing it is, even as we are ignorant of his essence, but it is not to be understood of that existence which is signified by the composition of the mind, for in this way it is possible to prove the existence of God, when our mind is led by demonstrative arguments to form a proposition stating that God is. Now in those arguments by which we prove the existence of God, it is not necessary that the divine essence or quiddity be employed as the middle term, as the second argument supposed, but instead of the quiddity we take his effects as middle term, as in the case in a posteriori reasoning. From these effects we take the signification of the word God, for all the divine names are taken either from the remoteness of God's effects from himself, or from some relationship between God and his effects. It is also evident from the fact that, although God transcends all sensibles and senses, his effects, from which we take the proof that God exists, are sensible objects. Hence our knowledge, even of things which transcend the senses, originates from the senses. Chapter 13. Arguments in Proof of God's Existence. Having shown then that endeavoring to prove the existence of God is not futile, we must proceed to set forth the reasons by which both philosophers and Catholic doctors have proved that there is a God. In the first place, we shall give the arguments by which Aristotle sets out to prove God's existence. He aims at proving this from movement in two ways. The first is as follows. Physics. Whatever is in motion is moved by another. Now it is clear to the sense that something is in motion, example, the sun, therefore it is in motion by something else moving it. Now that which moves it is itself either moved or not. If it is not moved, then the point is proved that we must postulate an immovable mover, and this we call God. If, however, it be moved, it is moved by another mover. Either, therefore, we must proceed to infinity, or we must come to an immovable mover, but it is not possible to proceed to infinity. Therefore, it is necessary to postulate an immovable mover. This argument contains two propositions that need to be proved, namely that whatever is in motion is moved by another, and that it is not possible to proceed to infinity in movers and things moved. The first of these is proved by the philosopher in three ways. First, thus, if a thing moves itself, it must have the principle of its movement in itself, otherwise it would clearly be moved by another. It also must be moved primarily, that is, it must be moved by a reason of itself and not by reason of its part, as an animal is moved by the movement of its foot. For in the latter way, not the whole, but the part would be moved by itself, and one part by another. It also must be divisible and have parts, since whatever is moved is divisible, as is proved in physics. These things being supposed, he argues as follows: that which is stated to be moved by itself is moved primarily. Therefore, if one of its parts is at rest, it follows that the whole is at rest. For if, while one part is at rest, another of its parts were in motion, the whole itself would not be moved primarily, but its part which is in motion, while another is at rest. Now nothing that is at rest while another is at rest is moved by itself, for that which is at rest as a result of another thing being at rest must be in motion as a result of the other's motion, and hence it is not moved by itself. Hence that which was stated to be moved by itself is not moved by itself. Therefore whatever is in motion must be moved by another. Nor is this argument negated by what might be said: supposing a thing moves itself, it is impossible for a part of it to be at rest. Nor again by the statement that to be at rest or in motion does not belong to a part except accidentally, as Avicenna quibbles. For the force of the argument lies in this, that if a thing moves itself primarily and of itself, not by reason of its parts, it follows that its being moved does not depend on anything, whereas with a divisible thing, being moved depends on its parts, as does its existence, so that it cannot move itself primarily and of itself. Therefore, the truth of the conclusion drawn does not require that we suppose as an absolute truth that a part of that which it moves itself is at rest, but that this conditional statement be true. If a part were at rest, the whole would be at rest, which statement can be true even if the antecedent be false, even as this conditional proposition is true: if a man is an ass, then he is irrational. Second, he proves it by induction in this way: physics. A thing is not moved by itself if it is moved accidentally, since its motion is occasioned by the motion of something else, nor again if it is moved by force, as is manifest, nor is it moved by its nature, like those things whose movement proceeds from themselves, such as animals, which clearly are moved by their souls. Nor if it is moved by nature, as heavy and light things are, since these are moved by their generating cause, and by that which removes the obstacle to their movement. Now all things that are in motion are moved either in themselves or accidentally, and if in themselves, either by force or by nature, and if the latter, either by something in them, as in the case of animals, or not by something in them, as in the case of heavy and light bodies. Therefore whatever is in motion is moved by another. Third, he proves his point thus: nothing is at the same time in act and in potency in respect of the same thing. Now whatever is in motion as such is in potency, because motion is the act of that which is in potency as such, physics. In contrast, whatever moves as such is in act, for nothing acts except in so far as it is in act. Therefore nothing is both mover and moved in respect of the same movement, hence nothing moves itself. We must observe, however, that Plato, Phaedrus 24, who asserted that every mover is moved, employed the term movement in a more general sense than Aristotle, for Aristotle took movement in its strict sense for the act of a thing that is in potency as such, in which sense it applies only to divisible things and bodies, as is proved in physics. But according to Plato, that which moves itself is not a body, for he took movement for any operation, so that it's to understand or to think is a kind of movement, to which manner of speaking Aristotle alludes to in De Anima. In this sense, then, he said that the first mover moves itself inasmuch as it understands, desires, and loves itself. This, in a certain respect, is not in contradiction with the arguments of Aristotle, for it makes no difference whether with Plato we come to a first mover that moves itself, or with Aristotle to something first which is altogether immovable. He proves the other proposition, namely that it is impossible to proceed to infinity in movers and things moved, by three arguments. The first of these is as follows: if one were to proceed to infinity in movers and things moved, all this infinite number of things would necessarily be bodies, since whatever is moved is divisible and corporeal, as is proved in physics. Now every body that moves through being moved is moved at the same time as it moves. Therefore all this infinite number of things are moved at the same time as one of them is moved, but one of them, since it is finite, is moved in a finite time. Therefore all this infinite number of things are moved in a finite time, but this is impossible. Therefore it is impossible to proceed to infinity in movers and things moved. That it is impossible for the aforesaid infinite number of things to be moved in a finite time, he proves thus. Physics. Mover and moved must be simultaneous, as he proves by induction from each species of movement. But bodies cannot be simultaneous except by continuity or contact. Therefore, since all the aforesaid movers and things moved are bodies, as proved, they must be as one movable thing through their continuity or contact, and thus one infinite being thing would be moved in a finite time, which is shown to be impossible in physics. The second argument, physics, in proof of the same statement is as follows. An inordinate series of movers and things moved, namely, where throughout the series one is moved by the other, we must find that if the first mover be taken away or cease to move, none of the others will move or be moved, because the first is the cause of movement in all the others. Now, if an ordinate series of movers and things moved proceed to infinity, there will be no first mover, but all will be like intermediate movers. Therefore it will be impossible for any of them to be moved, and thus nothing in the world will be moved. The third argument, physics, amounts to the same, except that it proceeds in the reverse order, namely by beginning from above. It is as follows. That which moves instrumentally cannot move unless there be something that moves principally, but if we proceed to infinity in movers and things moved, they will all be like instrumental movers, because they will be alleged to be moved movers, and there will be nothing by way of principal mover, therefore nothing will be moved. We have thus clearly proved both statements which were supposed in the first process of demonstration by which Aristotle proved the existence of a first immovable mover. The second way, physics, is as follows. If every mover is moved, this statement is true either in itself or accidentally. If accidentally, it follows that it is not necessary. For that which is accidentally true is not necessary, therefore it is a contingent proposition that no mover is moved. But if a mover be not moved, it does not move, as the opponent asserts. Therefore it is contingent that nothing is moved, since if nothing moves, nothing is moved. Now Aristotle holds this to be impossible, physics, namely that at any time there be no movement. Therefore the proposition was not contingent, because a false impossibility does not follow from a false contingency. And therefore this proposition, every mover is moved by another, was not accidentally true. Again, if any two things are found accidentally united in a certain subject, and one of them is to be found without the other, it is probable that the latter can be found without the former. Thus, if white and musical are found in Socrates, and musical without white is found in Plato, it is probable that white could be found without musical in some subject. Accordingly, if mover and moved be united together in some subject accidentally, and it be found that a certain thing is moved without its being a mover, it is probable that a mover is to be found that is not moved, nor can one urge against this the case of two things, one of which depends on the other, because those in question are united not per se, but accidentally. If, however, the aforesaid proposition is true in itself, again there follows something impossible or unfitting, for the mover must be moved, either by the same kind of movement or by another kind. If by the same kind, it follows that whatever causes alteration must itself be altered, and furthermore that the healer must be healed, that the teacher must be taught, and in respect of the same science. But this is impossible, for the teacher must have science, while the learner must not have it, and thus one thing will be possessed and not possessed by the same person, which is impossible, and if it be moved by another kind of movement, namely, so that what causes alteration be moved in respect of place, and that which moves in respect of place be increased, and so on, it will follow that we cannot go on indefinitely, since the genera and species of movement are finite in number, and thus there will be some first mover that is not moved by another, unless someone happens to say that a recurrence takes place in this way. Unless all the genera and species of movement have been exhausted, a return must be made to the first. For instance, if that which moves in respect of place be altered, and that which causes alteration be increased, then again that which is increased be moved in respect of place, but the consequence of this will be the same as before, namely that which moves by one kind of movement is itself moved by the same kind, although immediately and not immediately. It remains, therefore, that we must postulate some first mover that is not moved by anything outside itself. Since, however, it does not follow that a first mover that is not moved by anything outside itself is absolutely immovable, Aristotle proceeds further, saying that this may happen in two ways. First, so that this first mover is absolutely immovable, and if this is granted, our point is established, namely that there is a first immovable mover. Second, that this first mover is moved by itself, and this seems probable because what is of itself is always prior to what is of another. Hence it is likewise logical in things moved that what is moved first is moved by itself and not by another. But if this be granted, the same consequence follows, physics, for it cannot be said that the whole of what moves itself is moved by its whole self, because then the absurd consequences mentioned above would follow, namely that a person might teach and be taught at the same time, and in like manner as to other kinds of movements. And again, a thing would be at the same time in act and in potency, since a mover as such is in act, while that which is moved is in potency. It remains, therefore, that one part thereof is mover only, and the other part moved. And thus we have the same conclusion as before, namely that there is something that moves and is itself immovable. And it cannot be said that both parts are moved, so that one is moved by another, nor that one part moves both on itself and the other, nor that the whole moves a part, nor that part moves the whole. But since the above absurdities would follow that, namely, that something would both move and be moved by the same kind of movement, and that it would be at the same time in potency and in act, and finally that the whole would move itself not primarily but by reason of its part. It remains therefore that in whatever moves itself one part must be immovable and must move the other part. Since, however, in those things among us which move themselves, namely animals, the part which moves, namely the soul, though immovable of itself, is nevertheless moved accidentally, he goes on to show that in the first mover, the part which moves, is not moved neither of itself nor accidentally. Physics. For in those things which among us move themselves, namely animals, the part which moves is moved accidentally, since they are corruptible. Now those corruptible things which move themselves must be reducible to some first self-mover that is everlasting. Therefore that which moves itself must have a mover, which is moved neither of itself nor accidentally. It is clear that in accordance with this hypothesis, some self-mover must be everlasting, for if, as he supposes, movement is everlasting, the production of these self-movers that are subject to generation and corruption must be everlasting, but no one of these self-movers, since it does not always exist, can be the cause of this everlastingness, nor can all of them together, both because they would be infinite and because they do not exist altogether. It follows, therefore, that there must be an everlasting self-mover that causes the everlastingness of generation in these lower self-movers, and thus its mover is not moved neither of itself nor accidentally. Again, if we observe that in self-movers some begin to be moved anew on account of some movement whereby the animal is not moved by itself, for instance by the digestion of food or a change in the atmosphere, by this movement, the mover that moves itself is moved accidentally. From this, we may gather that no self-mover whose mover is moved essentially or accidentally, is always moved. But the first self-mover is always in motion, else movement could not be everlasting, since every other movement is caused by the movement of the very first self-mover. It follows, therefore, that the first self-mover is moved by a mover who is not moved, neither essentially nor accidentally. Nor is this argument rebutted by the fact that the movers of the lower spheres cause an everlasting movement, and yet are said to be moved accidentally. For they are said to be moved accidentally not by reason of themselves, but by reason of the things subject to their motion, which follow the motion of the higher sphere. Since, however, God is not part of the self-mover, Aristotle goes on in his Metaphysics to trace from this motor that is part of a self-mover another mover altogether separate, which is God. For since every self-mover is moved through its appetite, it follows that the motor, which is part of a self-mover, moves on account of the appetite for some appetible object. And this object is above the motor in moving, because the one desiring is a moved mover, whereas the appetible is a mover altogether unmoved. Therefore there must be a first mover separate and altogether immovable, and this is God. Now two things would seem to weaken the above arguments. The first of these is that they proceed from the supposition of the eternity of movement, and among Catholics this is supposed to be false. To this we reply that the most effective way to prove God's existence is from the supposition of the eternity of the world. When this is supposed, God's existence seems less manifest, for if the world and movement had a beginning, it is clear that we must suppose some cause to have produced the world and movement, because whatever becomes anew must take its origin from some cause of its becoming, since nothing evolves itself from potency to act or from non-being to being. The second is that the aforesaid arguments suppose that the first moved thing, namely the heavenly body, has its motive principle in itself, from which it follows that it is animated. Many do not grant this. To this we reply that if the first mover is not supposed to have its motive principle in itself, it follows that it is immediately moved by something altogether immovable. Hence also Aristotle draws this conclusion with an alternative, namely that either we must come at once to first mover immovable or separate, or to a self-mover, from which again we come to a first mover immovable and separate physics. The philosopher proceeds in a different way in metaphysics to show that it is impossible to proceed to infinity in efficient causes, but that we must come to one first cause, and this we call God. This is how he proceeds. In all efficient causes following in order, the first is the cause of the intermediate cause, and the intermediate is the cause of the ultimate, whether the intermediate be one or several. Now if the cause be removed, that which it causes is removed. Therefore if we remove the first, the intermediate cannot be a cause. But if we go on to infinity in efficient causes, no cause will be first. Therefore all the others which are indeterminate will be removed. Now this is clearly false, therefore we must suppose the existence of a first efficient cause, and this is God. Another reason can be drawn from the words of Aristotle, for in metaphysics he shows that those things which excel as true excel as beings, and in metaphysics he shows that there is something supremely true, because we see that of two false things one is falser than the other, from which it follows that one is also truer than the other. Now this is by approximation to that which is simply and supremely true. Therefore we may further conclude that there is something that is supremely being, and this we call God. Another argument in support of this conclusion is adduced by Damascene from the government of things, and the same reasoning is indicated by the commentator in physics. It runs as follows: it is impossible for contrary and discordant things to accord in one order, always or frequently, except by someone's governance, through which each and all are made to tend to a definite end. Now we see that in the world things of different natures accord in one order, not seldom or fortuitously, but always or for the most part. Therefore it follows that there is someone by whose providence the world is governed, and this we call God.